Hello, welcome to CTV. Our program today, I don't know if we can get the title up there, but it's Crisis at the Border. A purposely dubious title. We've obviously got something going on at the border, and there's been lots and lots of news about it, but whether it's actually a crisis or not kind of remains to be seen. But my name's Lindsay Rosa, and I'm here today with my friend Melanie Glover, who's an immigration attorney, and we're excited to have her here today. So, crisis at the border. Melanie is going to be talking with us a little bit later in the show about asylum and her experience doing immigration law, both here, stateside in Texas, as well as internationally. But I'm going to talk first for a little bit about that word crisis and what's really happening. So, as most of you know, there's been a lot of news about these caravans coming up from predominantly Honduras to the United States. And while it hasn't been as much in the news recently, it's still a thing that's happening and going on. Whether it constitutes a crisis isn't necessarily clear, but it's a thing that's happening. So I decided to go myself down to the border in Tijuana, where many of these migrants from the caravans were headed, and see for myself what exactly was happening there. So this past November, at the height of the influx of migrants from Tijuana or from Honduras, I headed down to the border, got myself a $12 hotel in Tijuana, right next to where the migrants were stationed at that time. And I was able to, we can put the visuals up if you want. I was able to bring donations from the wonderful people here in Grand Rapids. You made a donation, didn't you?
I did,
yeah.
Yes.
You did. All of my friends and family and acquaintances and random people from Facebook donated money and clothing and items. So I brought those down with me and distributed them, as well as taking some time to try and figure out what was really happening. So we can flip on to the next slide if you want. So when I first got there, this is what I saw. This was the original shelter in Tijuana where the migrants were being housed. So at this time, there was approximately 6,000 persons in this, what they call a deportivo. It's just an open air sports facility. And as you can see, it's very muddy, it was very cold, conditions were quite difficult. These migrants had traveled over 1,000 miles to get there with the hopes of later then crossing the border into the U.S. And when I say crossing the border, what I mean is turning themselves into immigration and asking for asylum. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important distinction to make, that it's not illegal to seek asylum. And Melanie's going to explain that a little bit further as we delve more into asylum. So this was the situation in November. That shelter has since been closed down, and things are a little haphazard now. I think the migrants are currently kind of just dispersed around the city in Tijuana. But we can go on to the next slide. And so these are just some pictures of food we bought. I was able to purchase for migrants in the caravan, medicine. I worked helping transport people from this very difficult shelter to stay in to churches that had opened their doors. So let's move on, because I want to talk about, you can keep going down these slides actually. The caravan. So what is the caravan? Who are these people? Why are they coming? And does it constitute a crisis? So it sounds scary. I think when it comes on the news, you've got close to 10,000 migrants walking up, from Honduras to the U.S. border. 10,000 seems like a big number. But the fact is that illegal border crossings have been dropping for almost 20 years. since the Bush administration, through the Obama administration, through the Trump administration, really since the early 70s, illegal border crossings have been dropping. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because in the 70s, I don't think people were talking about it, right, as much as they are now. So it's a hot topic, but it's actually less of an issue than it's ever been. One of the changes in illegal border crossings is that there's been an increase of families coming, and in the past, I think it was predominantly men who were leaving their families to come and work and send money back to their families and provide. Mm-hmm. But there's been like over a 300% increase in family units that have been leaving their homes and leaving everything behind to come seek safety in the United States. So since border crossings are down, and I think there's a number of reasons for that, particularly in Mexico, there's less Mexicans coming, but there's been an increase from people from what they call the Northern Triangle, which is El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Mm-hmm. So as places of Mexico have become safer, as the economy has improved a little bit in Mexico, there's actually been more Mexican immigrants going back to Mexico than what are coming. So there's like a negative net of Mexican immigration. But there's been an increase from this Northern Triangle, and there's been an increase of families. So the next question is, why? What is happening in the Northern Triangle? What is happening particularly in Honduras, where the much talked about caravans are coming from? And that was something that I talked about with the migrants that I met from the caravan. And some of the stories that I was hearing were stories of political oppression. So I met a guy named Jorge there. He was in one of the previous pictures, but he had been working with Los Liberales, which is a political group that is opposed to the current quote-unquote president. There's a lot of quotes in this crisis president. But the kind of, we'll talk about this a little more too, but the de facto dictator of Honduras. So he'd been working in opposition, and because that was under threat and was afraid for his life, and so he and his son came to Tijuana with the hopes of turning themselves into immigration and asking for asylum. I also heard stories from people who were running from gang violence. I met a young man who came with his younger brother, and he had been recruited by a gang, which is a very common thing. Mm-hmm. Really, once you reach a certain age in Honduras, you're very likely to be recruited at some point. So he'd been recruited by a gang, and what happens when you don't cooperate is you get killed. Very often, you get killed. And I worked also as a trauma therapist for 5 years with these kinds of children who are coming from Latin America, running from gang violence, and that was a really, really consistent story. If I'm, a 16-year-old boy from Honduras who comes to the U.S., I would know before I did the interview the story almost. He was trying to go to school. This was just like consistent. Kids trying to go to school, on their way to school, they get approached by a gang. They tell them to come work for them. They say, yeah, I'll think about it, and then they just stop going to school because they know that gang will be waiting for them. And the consequences are very dire if they don't. So this particular man that I met had been being recruited by a gang, he and his cousin, and they didn't want to participate, and his cousin was captured and cut into pieces and murdered. And so he took his younger brother, who was kind of coming of age as well, and they were also in Tijuana. So there's all of these immigrants in Tijuana, and we can go to the next slide as well. So there's 6,000 at this particular spot, and there's other ones on other places in the border. Do you want to go to the next slide? And those are some of their stories. another interesting thing that I found while I was there was the types of news distortions that the media has about what was happening there. And that picture on the bottom, you can just kind of see the back of me. I'm talking to a group of people. I'm wearing a green shirt. I'm wearing a green shirt and a red sweater in all the pictures because that was the only outfit I brought with me for the whole week. So I'm easy to identify. But I'm there talking with a group of really extreme right-wing, quote-unquote, reporters who are down there sort of harassing immigrants, but putting their right-wing spin on things. And it was kind of funny because as I was talking to them and I was working to educate them on the history of the US and Latin America and so on, one of the ladies of the group said that she had expected to go to Tijuana and see a bunch of drug dealers and like narco traffickers and hardened criminals.
Wow.
And she said, and this is like kind of her exact words, I was really surprised that they all seem to be a lot of decent families. And I was like, yes, correct.
They are people too.
Yeah, and that's a big news distortion that's happened, that the migrants at the border are criminals. And the reality is, if you know anything about the drug trade and how it works, narcos and big time drug dealers, they don't walk 1,000 miles through difficult terrain with nowhere to sleep, begging for food from people. That's just not how it functions. It's a multi-billion-dollar business. They have a lot of power. They have a lot of resources. So when you have a group of people traveling this way, you can be pretty sure they're people that are not involved in organized crime. So the news definitely, one of the things I learned from this trip was that the news, it doesn't just distort things in like a bias way where you've got like the liberal bias or the conservative bias. Those certainly exist, but all news sensationalizes things. Mm-hmm. And even even news that I trust to give pretty accurate information, they still have to make a bigger deal about things, than what it is, so that people watch. So this was happening at the border, but by and large, things were pretty peaceful. It wasn't like what the news was making of it. The border's not under attack. That's not happening. We're not under threat. Literally, these are people running for their lives. Some of them are running from poverty and not necessarily directly facing violence, but they're seeing that their neighbors are, facing violence and just generally living in a violent society. Honduras has the highest murder rate in the world right now. And want a better life for their children. So they're really coming to be productive, to find jobs, to pay taxes, so that their kids can have a decent life and an education. That would be, if you have to generalize about any group of people, that would be the generalization that I think that you could make. So I want to, before we get to Melanie, I want to talk briefly as well about Honduras and what has gotten us into this, the situation. Why particularly Honduras? Why are we getting like tens of thousands of migrants coming up specifically from Honduras? And that's an issue near and dear to my heart. I've been to Honduras, 6 or 7 times now, and I have a lot of friends and family there. And so to understand what's happening, we need to go back in time a little bit to about 2009. So we want to switch to the next slide. And Honduras went through a series of very right-wing dictators throughout most of its history. And in 2009, a guy named Mel Zelaya was elected to be president. 4 years before that. In 2006, he became president. And Mel Zelaya was more of a left-wing leader, and he started doing social reforms in Honduras. So he raised the minimum wage. He created social security programs for the older people and teachers. Poverty decreased. And he gained, I think you skipped ahead one. Can you go back one slide? Pablo, can you go back one slide, please? So, I'm lying. You were fine. maybe I put them out of order. So anyways, Mel Zelaya was a president that was very loved by the people. He gained the support of union groups and environmentalists, but he made enemies of the upper class. And so in 2009, the upper crust of Honduras and the military enacted a coup, and they kicked him out of the country. It was condemned by the whole world as a military coup. The U.S. publicly condemned this coup, although later on, as the story unfolded, it came out that Hillary Clinton and the Obama administration ultimately supported this military coup. So we can go to the next slide. So after this 2009 coup, Honduras has slowly slid into a straight up military dictatorship at this point. So, sorry, my slides were a little bit out of order, that was my fault. But that's Mel Zelaya, who created all of these social reforms. So after he was ousted, you can go to the next slide. They had, eventually this guy, Juan Orlando Hernandez, was elected in 2014. He was the president of the Congress when Mel Zelaya was ousted, and he was one of the guys saying that Mel is going to be a socialist dictator, and Mel's a drug dealer, and making all these kind of wild accusations that there was no actual proof of. So Juan Orlando is elected in 2014, and he stacks the Supreme Court. Honduras has a law that you can only be president for one term, and that's in their constitution. So Juan Orlando stacks the Supreme Court and takes a vote and just sort of unilaterally changes the constitution so that he can be president again for another term and potentially indefinitely at this point. The country was in uproar from this. There's pictures on there, the bottom pictures of protests that broke out all over the country. Fuera Jo is out, Juan Orlando Hernandez is the slogan of these protests. So Honduras is just in uproar. So after he changes the constitution, they have to be able to run again. They have new elections, and the left, the Partido Liberal, puts forth their own candidate, Nasrallas. And Nasrallas ends up being very popular and is, with 60% of the vote counted, he's up by 5 points and is the clear front runner to win this election. Obviously, this doesn't make Juan Orlando happy. So he shuts down the counting. Everything goes black for like 36 hours. And when the lights come back on, surprise, by some statistically almost impossible miracle, Juan Orlando is ahead. So he has he stole the elections. He's ultimately become a dictator, what he accused Mel Zelaya of being, but wasn't. And then the cherry on top, after also making these vague accusations and this sort of negative PR campaign against Zelaya and against the left, that he was involved in the drug trade, Juan Orlando, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 months ago, his brother was arrested in Florida for importing multi-tons of cocaine into the United States. Mm-hmm. His brother, so on that slide in the middle is a picture of a block of cocaine, and it's got the TH, that's Tony Hernandez. That's his product, and that's how he sells it, with the symbol. So Tony, Juan's brother, was also a congressman, made large donations to Juan's campaign. Obviously, Juan had no idea his brother was a multimillionaire in the drug trade and making all these big international deals. So the long story short is Honduras has fallen into a military dictatorship and has a narco dictator running the country. And the Honduran people are in a lot of trouble. And a lot of the things I hear when I talk about this and explain this story to people is, well, they need to go back and fix their country then. And let's talk about that and why can't they just go back and fix their country? Because it's not that simple. And people will say, well, the United States had a revolution. Why doesn't Honduras have a revolution? the truth is, most of Latin America at different times have had revolutions and have started democracies. Guatemala did, Honduras has. Honduras is on the verge of revolution all of the time, actually, and they might have one. I sort of hope that they don't, because I think they will get slaughtered, and it's not because the Honduran government is so powerful, it's because our government's so powerful. And our government has propped up right-wing military dictators all across Latin America throughout history, and we continue to today. So as I mentioned, when that 2009 coup happened and Hillary Clinton was accused of supporting it, and she's actually tried to defend her support of it, Republicans just, there's the only difference really between the response of Republicans and Democrats is that Democrats have a little shame in the fact that they support these right-wing military dictatorships, and Republicans just don't, and they just openly support them. So when that coup happened, 3 Congress people from Florida flew down to meet the new right-wing, participant in that military coup. So not only that, but the aid money, here's another quote, the aid money that we send to Honduras, 70% of that goes to the military. So we're funding right-wing militaries. Why, right? Like, why are we doing that? And that's a very valid question, and a question that I asked. So we can go on to the next slide. When you look, to understand that question why, you really have to look into the history of the U.S. and Latin America. So specifically the U.S. and Honduras, this is a little tidbit of the history. The more you delve into this, it just gets it goes from bad to worse. But back in the early 1900s, a guy named Zemurray started a company called Cuyamel Fruit Company. He's the guy on the top picture there. And he went and through some dirty deals with different dictators at the time, bought huge stretches of land in Honduras and began to farm it, and kicked off the rightful farmers, the peasants, from that land, making large profits for himself and having slave-like conditions for the Hondurans who initially had farmed that land and owned that land. So at some point, a president of Honduras was threatening his control of that land and was not giving him the very favorable business conditions that he wanted. So Zemurray, he actually did try to, this is kind of funny, he lobbied with the U.S. government, and he was one of the few where the U.S. government actually ignored him, because he wasn't quite as big as like the United Fruit Company, who very successfully lobbied with the U.S. government and got the U.S. government to back their political endeavors, so to speak, or their takeovers of different countries. But they ignored Zemurray because he wasn't as big and didn't have as much clout in the U.S. government. So he hired 2 American mercenaries and got a former ousted dictator, Bonilla, a Honduran dictator, and they joined forces, and they just together took over the Honduran government. And for Bonilla's help with that in 1912, they put him back into power, and to say in gratitude to Zemurray, Bonilla then awarded him large swaths of land and gave him all of the favorable business conditions that he needed. So a lot of people are shocked to hear those kinds of stories when I tell them, and for those of you listening, if you want to have a better understanding of the history of the U.S. and Latin America, Google Guatemalan genocide and the U.S.'s role in a 30-year genocide of the Guatemalan people that was to the tune of like 200,000 people dead, 40 to 50,000 disappeared, that the U.S. had full knowledge and participation of. And at that incident was the U.S. government, the CIA, actively involved in initiating and sustaining that 30-year incident. So anyway, there's not enough time to talk about everything. I'd like to talk about the history of the U.S. and Latin America. But I think it's super important to talk about, because you can't begin to understand the crisis that's happened, the crisis at the border, or the convergence of refugees that is happening there without looking into the history, because the history has completely influenced what's happening today. And really, it's not history. It's the same thing. You know, and so why would the U.S. continue to support right-wing military dictatorships in Honduras? Well, we have about 150 different industries or businesses invested there, and those businesses make money how? By paying really low wages, by polluting the environment, by taking over resources that should belong to the Honduran people. Honduras is a country full of resources. They have wood, they have textile factories, they have fruit. They're a very resource-rich country. There's no reason for them to be the second poorest country in Latin America. But they don't own their resources. U.S. companies do, and U.S. companies lobby with the U.S. government to make sure that they keep right-wing dictatorships in place that will give these companies favorable conditions. And that is why Honduras is in the situation they're in. That is why Honduras has been cited as the most dangerous country in the world to be a union leader or to be an environmentalist. So, those are the push factors, and that explains why all of these people from Honduras particularly, but also other countries, are coming to the border. Now I want to kind of turn to you, Melanie, and get some of your expert insight into what happens. So what's next? So all of these migrants, they come to the border, they're looking for asylum. What is asylum? Where does that law come from? And what does that process look like for them?
Sure, yeah. So thank you, Lindsay, for sharing your story about coming to the border, going to the border, and all the good work that you did there. Definitely support you in that, and I'm happy to hear about it, and as well as all of the history. I should preface by saying that I have practiced immigration law for a few years, but it was a few years ago, and so I can speak to my experiences during that time. But the good thing is that, good or bad, blessing or curse, that immigration law really hasn't changed since the 90s, and we don't foresee it changing. We've had 2 administrations now that are exercising prosecutorial discretion under the Obama administration, and now Trump, with seems enhanced border security interest, to put it lightly. So there are other ways through executive enforcement, law enforcement action, that we see immigration law being interpreted, but not necessarily changing. So the way that you apply for asylum is the way that you were able to apply for asylum if you're a foreign national, afraid for your life, afraid for persecution in your home country when I was practicing.
So asylum that's a right that I have too, and you have. Like to apply for, if any of us feel threatened in our country, is that correct? We can go to Canada, we could go to Mexico, we could go wherever and apply for asylum.
So it depends on whether that country has signed the Geneva Convention and participates with that definition of refugee and asylum, that principle. But I don't have all the countries memorized, but most countries do. And then it just becomes a matter of what type of asylum law that country wants to create and enforce. So as a foreign national meaning somebody who doesn't have legal permission to be here, would come to the U.S. seeking asylum, he or she would have to demonstrate a well-founded fear of persecution, either past or future, based on five categories that the U.S. has adopted, and that persecution needs to be based on fear of being persecuted for political opinion, nationality, race, religion, and social group. And related to all of the gang violence and the government conditions that you talked about, and the crises that you talked about just now, those are all categories that we've seen a lot of Central American, foreign nationals, Central American immigrants coming to the border asking for asylum, requesting asylum based on that category of social group, that they've been persecuted because of crisis in their home country, because of the government persecuting them, or the government not being willing to stop persecution against them. The military, for example, I I had a client who was afraid for her life in El Salvador because the government military would send officials to her house, and this was a few years ago, of course, but they would come and they would threaten her for her life. And what you spoke about as far as the gang violence and people in Central America feeling threatened for their lives, I saw that with my clients too. They would tell me, well, we have to pay the renta, the rent or the fee, the fee to exist,
safety money
on their block or their house. Right. And then if they didn't pay that, then they would face death, right? And so you have to have that type of fear and demonstrate that type of fear when you come to the border to ask for it, or if you are already here physically as a foreign national. Alien is the way that it's described in our immigration laws in the U.S. today, but foreign national is a friendlier term. Then you have to be physically present, so either at the border or in the U.S., and within 1 year apply for asylum.
So that's an important distinction because you can't, I think people consistently look at these crises at the border and the people coming as illegal, but you can't apply for asylum unless you're there. You have to come and you have to cross and turn yourself into immigration in order to apply.
Yes.
So they're exercising a right they have under the Geneva Convention, under international law that we've signed on to, correct?
Yes. Yeah, so there are other, refugee resettlement camps that abroad they can, through other nonprofit agencies that the U.S. government has relationships with, try to set up, a way to get here and enter as a refugee.
Correct.
But that's already under an approved program and an approved partnership that camp, that nonprofit agency would have with the U.S. government. So asylum, though, an asylee has to be here physically at the border inside the U.S. already to request it.
Okay, so then let's make it real. So my friend Jorge, for example, he was in fear for his life because of his opposition to the dictator that Honduras currently has. So he goes and turns himself over to Border Patrol at the border with Tijuana. What happens next?
So then he would need to say, I'm afraid for my life, I want to request asylum. And typically it doesn't have to be as formal as that. They don't have to be asking for asylum. Sometimes they don't know what they're asking for. They just have to understand that they're expressing a fear. And then typically Customs and Border Protection is at the border and would receive them or may catch them crossing, and then they would be turned over to ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and they would start the process of having to demonstrate through a credible fear interview whether they are indeed afraid under the laws in the U.S. related to asylum. And there is a whole bunch of case law about what is a well-founded fear, what is past persecution. The definition of refugee is in the Immigration and Nationality Act, but there are a lot of terms that are still, even today litigated by Board of Immigration Appeals, the circuit courts, and so that the social group also is one of them, the particular social group, and so it can be difficult to prove your case, but the credible fear interview is the first step to proving your case after you enter.
So Jorge crosses the border, turns himself into Border Patrol, says, I don't want to return to Honduras because I'm afraid for my life. And that what should get him a credible fear hearing, where he has to, in a kind of low level way, I guess, prove, that's not his full case, right?
No, I mean, he could be, if he demonstrates that he has a well-founded fear of persecution, then he could, if he meets all the requirements, he could be granted asylum. But what we've seen in the past few years is that typically cases are handed over to immigration judges. So even if people apply affirmatively coming to the border instead of defensively as a relief mechanism through immigration court, which you're in immigration court because you're being deported, then those folks typically are transferred to the immigration court to have their case heard on the merits, and that usually means a hearing. I mean, that's a hearing. And so then it gets a little more challenging for the foreign national, a little more stressful, right, of an environment.
So you can be granted asylum after that first credible fear? It's possible to?
In my experience, yes. I'm not sure what the practice is now, and whether the immigration officers, USCIS conducts the interviews now with the credible fear. I'm not sure if they are what the practice is, but
in my experience with work, and I not as an attorney, but as a mental health professional, working with people who've gone through this process, most of them, if they get past the credible fear, they're just getting permission to like have a hearing, a larger case in immigration court.
Right.
And sometimes these cases can last years or like long periods of time.
Yeah, so I mean, I did have clients that passed their credible fear interview and got the grant of asylum. But typically, when you are an immigration attorney at a firm in private practice, not working for the government, but private practice, they come to you, foreign nationals come to you after they've already had their case referred to immigration court and they need help defending their asylum claim.
Okay. So tell us what are some typical cases you saw, and was it very sad? I mean, did you win a lot? Did you lose a lot? How did these cases tend to go?
So I would say, at least where I was practicing in Texas, that it was difficult, to be frank with you. It was difficult. I mean, we did the best we could, of course, for our clients, but at the end of the day, it's the judge's decision. There's no jury in immigration court. So it's the judge's decision whether you get your case granted or denied. And of course, there's an appeal process, but I would say 50% of the cases we saw success, and 50% probably had to be either appealed or the client just decided, you know what, I don't have the resources to go through this process, because it does cost money in court fees and lawyers if you want to hire representation. The types of cases that I dealt with, Central Americans in the social group category, Coptic Christians from Egypt on the religion basis, also Christians from Iran that were afraid to be persecuted because death is punishment, right, for not believing in Islam there. And so those were, I would say, with the religion cases, it's more cut and dry. With the social group cases, which are the ones relevant to this discussion today, those were more difficult because it is harder to prove the social group. There's more case law around that.
And I think largely we're probably talking about gang-based asylum. So the other guy that I met who brought his little brother, whose cousin had been brutally murdered for not participating in a gang. So you're saying those cases are much more difficult than to win? In
my experience, yes. Yes, because you have to prove that the gang is the social group that's persecuting you, and that the government is either not doing anything about it or is somehow involved with it. And that sounds legitimate, right?
Yeah, I was going to say the government's not.
Right, the government's
not
doing anything about it.
The government is literally the narco traffickers themselves.
Right.
So,
but at least in my experience, there's just this resistance to that category because it's not as well defined as the other ones.
So you were working under the Obama administration, and you're saying that it was already difficult then to win a gang-based asylum case, which is, and I don't have statistics on this, but a very large number of the cases coming up from Central America, from this northern triangle, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, which boast some of the highest murder rates in the world due to gang violence. So is it possible then, because of that distinction of being government-sponsored persecution and being part of a social group, to prove in court that you're going to be killed if you're sent back and still be sent back?
Yes. So you could prove it, but there's still discretion involved. And what I would always tell my clients is you have to demonstrate credibility as well. You can't just go in there and tell your facts, but you have to get the judge to believe you. And obviously you have to do that honestly. And if there are any missing information, if there's any missing information in your application or inconsistent facts, then that could be used against you. Just one little thing could be used against you. And so, yes, unfortunately, I did see some of that. And yes, you can have a really great case, but if you don't present it well, or if the judge decides in his or her discretion not to grant it to you, then yes, you can still be removed.
And in my experience as well, I've seen that in one case in an agency I used to work at, where the report, the distinction was one social worker had written that this child was assaulted with a brick, and another one said a stone. And that could have been, I mean, I speak Spanish and I do these interviews, and my Spanish is pretty good, but there's different colloquial terms for different things, and not every social worker's Spanish is that great. They could have just misunderstood that, and the whole case was thrown out because of that one thing. And another really sad story, a boy in a sister program to the one I was working with was deported despite his insistence that he would be killed, and he was deported back to Honduras, and within days was cuartizado. They call it cuartizado, that he was chopped into pieces.
Yes, same experience as you. There could be one detail in either a counselor report, or somebody didn't write it down correctly on the I-589, which is the application for asylum, or in an affidavit supporting that application, and maybe there's one detail that comes out in somebody's testimony that conflicts with the original story. It could be translation or otherwise, but you just have to be so careful, because anything could be used against the applicant to question his or her credibility.
Yeah. What about like the regional influence of immigration law? Like, is immigration law, it doesn't sound from your description like it's very cut and dry. Like you're saying there's a lot of discretion, and how are your chances better in one state versus another state, and how does that normally play out for winning an asylum case?
So the California and the Ninth Circuit, everybody knows, is very liberal. I mean, I shouldn't say everybody knows, but it has a reputation for being very liberal. And in consultation with colleagues and other immigration attorneys in other states like California, or like the East Coast, New York, Virginia, we did see more success rates with asylum. In Texas, not so much, right? There are just certain cities where you didn't have, a foreign national wouldn't have as great of a chance of success based on our experience.
Yeah. So, and that really resonates with me in cases that I've followed, that immigration law is very regional and depends a lot on the politics and how liberal, how conservative that state is, whether, these big, it's sad because these are life-altering decisions that are being made, and can be life-ending decisions in cases, and it's not, it sounds like they're looking for any tiny little thing, any hole, any excuse to throw the case out.
Yes, they are. So, and not so much the judge, but it's the prosecutor's job to find those holes and try to destroy credibility. I mean, that's a tactic we saw.
Yeah. Well, and I think that sometimes my opinion is that the prosecutor's job is to uphold justice, and that sometimes they can be overly aggressive and aren't necessarily looking to uphold justice, but just to win, and and just to get more deportations that they can check onto their tally.
Yes. Yeah. Unfortunately, yes. I can see that. But I understand they have a job to do, but they also have to do it the right way. And so, credibility, attacking somebody's credibility by pointing out any inconsistent details is one way that they do that.
Yeah. So we've talked about that's basically how difficult things were under the Obama administration, which of course was a more supposedly more liberal administration, although we know Obama deported more people than Bush did.
Correct.
And he had a very mixed record when it came to immigration. Obama did DACA, but Obama also paid Mexico to deport children from their border. And I made a trip to Guatemala to investigate when that was happening and what was happening to these children being held in the Mexican detention center and sent back. So a mixed bag with Obama. You haven't been practicing under Trump, but there have been some changes to asylum policy, I guess, not necessarily law, because like you said, the law has been pretty consistent. But one thing that affects Tijuana and my friends that I made in Tijuana is something called the metering policy. And that has really kind of been happening since 2016. But so when all of these migrants came from Honduras, and the Trump administration knew that they were coming and could have been preparing for processing these asylum cases and try and keep things orderly and not have a huge crisis of thousands of people stuck at the border in these awful camps. Instead of what would have made sense to me, making sure there are enough asylum officers there to process these cases so that the ones that have a legitimate fear can, begin their process, and the ones that don't can make their decisions and either stay in Mexico or go back. He limited the number of cases they could process a day. And while I was there, it was like 40 a day. And in that one camp, there's 6,000 people. There's, about 10,000 across the border, stuck in what is a very dangerous city, a country that's not their own, where they're facing a certain amount of persecution also from they're not from Mexico. And if you didn't know, not all Latin Americans get along, right? They don't. They have their own issues with discrimination and racism, just like all countries, all regions of the world do. So Trump started metering, and that caused these asylum seekers who are just like exercising their right, as we've established, to be stuck in Tijuana for months at a time. And one really sad story that just got to me, while I was there, I went to a children's home for unaccompanied minors, kids that are underage and are traveling by themselves. And there's a lot of them because once they get in those early teen years, they're getting, recruited by gangs, and if they don't want to participate, they have to go. They just have to go. It's a life or death situation. So I went, 3 different times I went to this children's shelter, and I played soccer with them. And these are the cohort that I used to do therapy with. So these are, just like my kids. And it was nice to see a shelter running. They were very well treated there, and they were telling me, their hopes and dreams. And that's why I love working with kids, because they're not totally jaded yet, and they're hopeful. They're still hopeful. They're still hopeful they can finish school. They're still hopeful that they can get a good job and send money to their mom, or they have these dreams. And it's sad because I know some of them are unrealistic for them. Like what is available to my child and, your future children isn't available to them. And it's hard to look a kid in the face and, hear their dreams and know that might not happen for you. But I loved meeting with them, and I love their positivity, and and I love that they're still going for it, and they see the United States as even though it's rejecting them and making it really hard for them to have any opportunity, they still see it as a land of hope and opportunity. And but Tijuana is a dangerous city. It's dangerous for the people who live there, and it's even more dangerous if you don't have a home. You don't have a door to close behind you at night. There's tons of organized crime in Tijuana. I met a pastor there who was on his 3rd business. He was a working pastor because every time he got a business going, he would get the la renta, or the safety money he had to pay to gangs. And so eventually he would just drop that business, go somewhere else, start another one. So he was on his 3rd. People were disappearing from the caravan while I was there. They were looking for women who had disappeared. They were right next to the red light district, which is rife with human trafficking. And shortly after I left, I hadn't met these particular boys because they arrived after I left, but 3 boys left the children's shelter to go back to where the rest of the caravan was, and to meet with their friends that they had traveled with. And they were kidnapped, they were tortured, and it's graphic, but they were stripped naked and tortured with scissors, and murdered. And one of them was murdered by, they choked him with putting a stick down his throat. And that was, that was very hard for me to hear, because I know I didn't meet them, but I know them. I know all of these kids, and they shouldn't have to leave their home. The United States has created this issue throughout history and currently in Honduras, and continued to support right-wing military dictatorships that make it impossible for people to live. So these boys are forced out of their home. They shouldn't be by themselves in a city like that, but we're metering, and we don't want to process more than 40 cases a day, so they have to wait in this dangerous place. And if that weren't enough, the latest change is called the Return to Mexico policy. And this one just killed me because we just went through, they have this awful journey to get to the border. They have to wait for their turn in line to go do a credible fear hearing. You might not pass that. But let's say, my friend Jorge, he does all that. For example, he walks 1,000 miles, he waits months at the border, he gets his credible fear hearing. They let him go through to process his case, and then they send him back to Tijuana while it processes. And that's what our administration is doing now, and these are people that aren't granted asylum yet. They've been granted the right to apply for asylum ultimately, and they're being sent back to Tijuana to wait who knows how long to present evidence in court. How are they supposed to find a lawyer? Where's the money for transportation coming? They're penniless at this point. Where's their ability, their phones and fax machines and things they need to get the documentation they need of what's happening to them? Yeah. All of those resources. So the Trump administration effectively has made it as difficult as humanly possible, maybe just impossible, for people to exercise their right for asylum and their I want to say greater human right to save their own lives. Mm-hmm. I don't think, there shouldn't be laws that prohibit you from saving your life. Mm-hmm. If you see someone drowning, you should help pull them out, mm-hmm. or you shouldn't push them back down if they're climbing back out themselves, right?
Right. Yep. No, I agree. It's my opinion too that he's definitely deterring people from applying for asylum and going through the process of doing so. When I was practicing, while your case is pending, you can apply for work authorization. So there is that benefit to the asylum application process. Well, if you're in Tijuana, you're not going to be working in the United States while your case processes to help you with those resources, right? Mm-hmm. You're not going to be a contributing, productive member of the U.S. society to the extent that you're able while your case is processing, because you're not here. So I can see it definitely is a deterrent, and I'm sure that's what the purpose is. Yeah. Unfortunately.
Yeah. There was one. Well, we can talk about one slightly positive thing, or a negative thing that didn't happen, so we're going to call it positive. Mm-hmm. Another thing that this administration tried to do, Jeff Sessions, there's one thing that he did do, and that was with gender-based asylum law. So it used to be that for women who are running, particularly women who are running from domestic violence situations, would be categorized as a special people group for being women. Correct? Mm-hmm. Is that about right? Maybe not the perfect legalese, but
right.
Okay,
no.
In layman's terms. And from what a lot of attorneys have told me, that was a little bright spot in immigration law, that those were kind of winnable cases. And the rate of femicide across Latin America is astronomical. Violence against women is a serious problem. Mm-hmm. So you have a lot of very legitimate cases of women coming. Jeff Sessions decided that no longer would be a category. So those, technically that just doesn't qualify anymore from what I've read and heard. The Trump administration also tried to categorically deny all gang-based cases. And as you and I just discussed, it's already very difficult to win a gang-based case because of the way the asylum law is written. But they were working to make it just flat out impossible. That was struck down by the Supreme Court, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg was the deciding vote from her hospital bed. Woohoo! and they were able to stop that. So people still can apply on those gang-based cases, but they continue to be difficult. And I'm going to say more difficult to win. And one thing that I've learned being involved in the issue is that culture matters. And the culture, the tone that's set by the administration has a huge impact because you're dealing with so much discretion of the judges. It's not cut and dry, you know. It's not did you pay this ticket or not pay this ticket or something. It's like the culture that they're under decides.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, like I said, you have to prove that you have a believable case. And if for some reason the judge thinks you're lying or you have, they can identify holes in your arguments or there's one little thing off, then that could destroy the whole case. That could sink the whole case. And it sounds like it's not fair, but if the judge doesn't like you, whether, you know, if the judge can articulate a reason for why you're not credible then, and use that in his or her discretion, then it's difficult.
Yeah. You're being really nice about
I am, yes, it's difficult.
Well, Melanie, we only have a couple minutes left. You also practiced immigration law abroad as well?
So I studied Spanish and European immigration law. I'm not qualified to practice law in Spain, but I did work with some nonprofit organizations in Spain with immigrants and refugees there. And from a legal perspective, I mean, I would work alongside lawyers and social workers. And from that perspective, Spain and Europe treats, in my opinion, immigrants and refugees much better. Probably a little less now with all of the influx of the sub-Saharan African immigrants and refugees going up to Europe by way of the cayucos, the little boats. And you hear the stories of them ending up in Italy and Greece and Spain, Morocco. Making their way up to Europe. There's a huge influx now, and so, you know, Germany, France, Spain, they're all having more issues. But as far as how they were treated, I would say they were treated, at least when I was in Spain, working, which was a few years ago now, but it was much better than if I compare it to my experience with how immigrants were treated in the U.S. as far as social services go, because the U.S. doesn't give social services to people who are not from here, who can't show that, resident, citizen. We don't give social services to immigrants and refugees, public social services.
Yeah, so while you're going through an asylum case, you're not feeding off the system, so to speak. It's a big misnomer I think a lot of U.S. citizens have about immigrants. If you don't have a social number, you don't get welfare, and even if you're in process of a case, you're paying for your lawyer, you're paying for your food, you're figuring out some way to pay rent or to find someone to stay with.
Right, and even those folks, foreign nationals that come here legally who aren't applying for asylum, you have to demonstrate that you will not become a public charge. So it's just not a value in this country to give social services to foreign nationals. So I, in my experience, saw that they were treated much better in Spain.
Well, thank you everyone for